Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, and good day everyone. I am Miss Nurjaima Ampuan, and my assigned topic for this subject, EDU 504, is about the indigenous people education in the Philippines. Now, what are indigenous people? According to Walter 2016, as mentioned by Ganal 2017, indigenous peoples are known to be as first people, original people, and native people that are ethnic groups who descended from and identified with the original inhabitants of the region. So in the consolidated report by the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples, in Philippines, there are about 110 indigenous peoples communities numbering between 15 million to 20 million, wherein 30% is in Luzon and less than 10% is in Visayas and more than 60% is in Mindanao. Since Philippines has a large number of indigenous people, the government through the Department of Education had developed a curriculum to cater the rights of these indigenous people to have education. So let's talk about the most recent developed curriculum for IP learners. This is the Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework. Now, according to DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015, this curriculum framework is pursuant to the DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011 entitled Adopting Indigenous Peoples Education or IPED Policy Framework. DepEd Order number 43 series of 2013 entitled as Implementing Rules and Regulations of Republic Act number 100533, otherwise known as Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. So before we discuss thoroughly the IP or Indigenous Peoples curriculum, let us first identify one of the issues which pressed the Department of Education to create the said curriculum. Now, what is this issue? In the consolidated reports by the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples, discrimination is being experienced in two ways. It could be from the people and from the education system itself. According to Ganal 2007, the UNESCO confirmed that millions of children are taught in the languages that they do not use or understand. So, participation in designing the curricula is limited, and education failed from eliminating prejudice and discrimination of indigenous peoples. And since these IP learners are taught in the languages that they do not understand, so they have encountered difficulties in comprehension, and according to the study of Adonis 2010, for those at school, many encounter various forms of discrimination from the majority who reinforce stereotypes about them being backward, uncivilized, or ignorant. And because of these experiences, the IP learners had a hard time adjusting to these difficulties. So, how to address this issue? The DepEd has its own way on how to solve this issue. In DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015, it states that there is a need for teachers in indigenous communities to be adequately oriented and trained so that indigenous cultures are appreciated and indigenous cultural practices and values are not discriminated as backward, inferior, invalid, or primitive. Now, with regards to the use of language for instruction as one form of prejudice and discrimination, the former DepEd Secretary Armen Luister said that DepEd values indigenous languages in the implementation of a mother tongue-based multilingual education among indigenous learners in order to regenerate and enrich the community's indigenous knowledge systems and practices and indigenous learning systems. Now, to discuss the indigenous people's education curriculum, this curriculum aims to recognize the right of indigenous peoples to basic education that is culturally rooted and responsive. The IPED curriculum framework seeks to provide guidance to schools and other education programs, both public and private, as they engage with indigenous communities in localizing, indigenizing, and enhancing the K-12 curriculum based on their respective educational and social context. It also establishes institutionalized partnership between indigenous communities and the respective schools or learning programs which serves them. This is to be pursued through sustainable community engagement, which guarantees the meaningful participation of indigenous communities in the recognition of their indigenous knowledge systems and practices and indigenous learning systems in the basic education curriculum. Now, in relation to the global movement for education for all, in which indigenous people are part of this advocacy, this curriculum enables the IPs or the indigenous peoples to develop competencies such as basic literacy and livelihood education for them to respond to the demand of the wider society. Now, to discuss the philosophy of this curriculum, the K-12 basic education curriculum centers on the learner, particularly on being and becoming a whole person equipped with 21st century skills for lifelong learning and leading a productive and full life. Recognizing the diversity of learners, the curriculum seeks to be inclusive. This is actualized through the implementation of programs that are meant to address the physical, intellectual, psychosocial, and cultural needs of learners. That is included in the Section 8 IRR of RA 10533. The emphasis on the inclusiveness of enhanced basic education is linked to the understanding that responding to the physical, intellectual, psychosocial, and cultural needs of learners is fundamental to their being and becoming whole persons. For indigenous learners, the cultural dimension is of primary importance in making their education meaningful and relevant. Culture is the collective expression of indigenous communities of their IKSPs, passed on from one generation to another through their respective indigenous learning system. The indigenous learning system of the community has been the educational process and structure by which the teaching and learning of IKSPs have been developed, maintained, and enriched. IKSPs, on the other hand, is the body of knowledge and developed and organized by the community across generations, and since this is at the core of their way of life, it is fundamental to the community's sense of collective and individual identity. So, what are the key elements of indigenous people education curriculum? So, first we have curriculum design, competency, and context. Interfacing the national curriculum with IKSPs and ILS, or the Indigenous Learning System, the design of a culturally appropriate and responsive curriculum has the following features. It anchors the learning context on the ancestral domain, the community's worldview, and its indigenous cultural institutions. The ancestral domain is one of the defining features of indigenous communities. It is valued not only as source of daily subsistence, but also as manifestation of the intertwining of the community's cultural, social, and spiritual dimensions. In the face of displacements and migration, the sense of belongingness to one's ancestral domain, the deep understanding of the community's worldview, and the continuing practice of cultural institutions serves as sources of strength and resilience of communities. This also includes and respects the community's expression of spirituality as part of the curriculum's context. Central to the worldview and culture of indigenous communities is a spirituality which is rooted in the ancestral domain and expressed in their way of life and relationships. Being integral to community life, the spiritual dimension in the learning and practice of IKSPs shall be included and also respected. Affirms and strengthens indigenous cultural identity. The curriculum should foster in indigenous learners a deep appreciation of their cultural identity by strengthening their relationship to their ancestry, community history, and way of life. Deeply cherished values of the community permeate the learning experience to anchor their sense of self and identity. It also revitalizes, regenerates, strengthens, and enriches IKSPs, ILS, and indigenous languages. The curriculum recognizes IKSPs as the collective prior knowledge of indigenous learners. The IKSPs in the curriculum contributes to the ongoing transmission of the community's cultural wealth to indigenous learners and to their meaningful practice in contemporary times. And also, for the advancement, it also includes advancement of indigenous people's rights and welfare. The curriculum should highlight competencies that enable indigenous learners to participate in community affairs in the service of developing and protecting their ancestral domain, IKSPs, and self-governance mechanisms. The teaching methodologies and strategies is also a key element in the indigenous people's education curriculum. A culturally appropriate and responsive curriculum employs teaching methodologies and strategies that strengthen, enrich, and complement the community's indigenous teaching learning process. Such methods and strategies are spiritual dimension of teaching and learning. IKSPs should be recognized and included in planning learning activities. The conduct of rituals related to particular IKSPs to be learned shall be the purview of the community and shall be planned with community elders. It also includes culture bearers and IKSPs holders. Recognizing that the main transmitters of IKSPs are the culture bearers and IKSPs holders who use appropriate methods and strategies in teaching this. They shall be active knowledge managers in the teaching learning process. In the education process, the IKSP holders and culture bearers not only provide and validate information, but also facilitate learning. Their active participation shall ensure that IKSPs are transmitted in their proper context and meaning, and in a manner appropriate to the kind of knowledge being taught. Content that are best implemented by and with the culture bearers and IKSP holders shall be community's purview, and the learning process for content which are linked to community life and culture shall be designed in consultation with them. Note that the teaching methodologies and strategies inherent to the indigenous learning system of the community shall be given premium to ensure that the learning styles and processes that indigenous learners are already exposed to are cultivated and nurtured. The appropriate introduction and application of teaching methodologies and strategies coming from outside and community shall be discussed with the community. Another key element is the learning space and environment. A culturally appropriate and responsive curriculum recognizes that the ancestral domain where IKSPs are experienced, live, and learned is the primary learning environment and learning space of indigenous learners. The teaching learning process shall be designed to maximize the ancestral domain and the activities of the community as relevant venues and settings for learning in combination with classroom-based sessions, fostering among learners the appreciation for and practice of lifelong learning while deepening their relationship with the ancestral domain. The guidance of the community shall be sought when designing learning activities that involve going to particular places in the ancestral domain to ensure that sacred places are not violated and cultural norms are observed while going and staying in the learning area. Another key element, we have learning resources. So it involves three resources rather. Instructional materials and other learning resources shall be developed and utilized in line with the described curriculum content and teaching learning processes. This includes artifacts, stories, dances, songs, musical instruments, and the like. The ancestral domain is, by itself, a source of a variety of learning resources as well. This also includes the language used in instructional materials, especially for the primary years, which highlights the use of the mother tongue, shall be determined in dialogue with the community. And also, instructional materials need to be reviewed by the IKSP holders. Protocols in the development of learning resources that are to be published shall be discussed and agreed upon with the community to protect the community's intellectual property rights and in keeping with related ethical principles and practice. And lastly, we have classroom assessment. Assessment shall be done utilizing tools appropriate to the standards, competencies, skills, and concepts being covered. Their design and use shall address the needs and concerns of the community and shall be developed with their participation. This includes community-generated assessment process that are part of the community's indigenous learning system shall be included in the range of assessment methods and tools that will be employed to assess learning. The use of other assessment process generated outside the community shall consider community values and culture before administration. These may be modified as needed given cultural considerations without sacrificing the objective and essence of the assessment process. And lastly, assessment process shall foster lifelong learning competencies that include preparation for community responsibilities through assessment tools and exercises that give premium to the application of higher order thinking skills and integrative understanding across subject areas and the practice of competencies in actual community and family situations. So, to differentiate localization and indigenization, localization refers to the process of relating learning content specified in the curriculum to local information and materials in the learner's community. The process of localization focuses on the enhancement of curriculum content and is generally the same for all communities in the country. Just for example, translating a story specified in the teacher's guide to the locality's language. For example, you translate a popular story. Just example, we have si Pagong at si Matsing. You will translate that into their local language. Or you can also use local facts as examples for lessons. Like you use local plans as examples for competencies that require discussing plans. Or name of persons commonly used in the locality and local products when you are formulating problem-solving statements. Or also you can use local resources as materials for instructional aids, like for example, parts of the local plants like the leaves, the bark, the fiber to enhance your posters and manipulatives, actual plants or animals as specimen. On the other hand, indigenization refers to the process of enhancing curriculum competencies, education, and teaching learning processes in relation to the biogeographical, historical, and socio-cultural context of the learner's community. Indigenization may also involve the enhancement of the curriculum framework, curriculum design, and learning standards of subject areas guided by the standards and principles adhered to in the national curriculum. The process of indigenization is to be undertaken nationwide in both the formal education system and alternative learning system as a means of enhancing the various elements of the national curriculum to make it more relevant and responsive to the learner's contexts. So let's have an example of curriculum under the Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum. So we have here a curriculum of a kindergarten. So more than half of the competencies of the kindergarten curriculum are not quarter or week specific to allow flexibility to enhance the design of the curriculum. These time-flexible competencies can be taught in relation to the annual or periodic livelihood activities of the community and in consonance with community knowledge and skills that children spontaneously learn during these activities. The scheduling of competencies will also be guided by the learning standards and the needed scope and sequence of competencies. So it has a community activity, like for example, we have planting season sa first quarter, and then the learning competencies. So we have nakakagawa ng may kusa. So you will do you will instruct them to have children's chores related to planting, which can be demonstrated in the schoolyard, can serve as a starting point. So the listed competencies are just examples of competencies that can be related to the community activity and are not sequenced in the order in which these are to be taken up in class. Highlighted is the possibility of integrating the time-flexible competencies with the time-indicated competencies in the National Curriculum Guide in relation to the community activity. So this is an example of enhancing the curriculum itself, since the integration of competencies is being done in relation to the community context. Now, to end my discussion, I will leave a saying or a quote from Ola Joseph says that diversity is not about how we differ. Diversity is about embracing one another's uniqueness. That's all, and thank you for listening.